Hey everybody. So you might remember that just before the election, Jeff Bezos instructed the Washington Post editorial page not to make a presidential endorsement this year. And he said that going forward, the paper wasn't going to be making any endorsements. And he gave some reasoning for what was really a dramatic change of policy that might have sounded justifiable if it had happened like in another context. But it came as a surprise, sort of out of nowhere, right before the most significant election in at least my lifetime. And so it felt like a crushing blow to some of us who consider ourselves part of the pro-democracy movement, or whatever you want to call this. And especially since Bezos had adopted the phrase "democracy dies in darkness" as the motto for the Washington Post. So if you hang out at some of the same places that I do online, you've probably seen a different phrase lately. This phrase, "do not obey in advance." And as we'll see in a moment, Jeff Bezos' decision, basically, I think, not to ruffle Donald Trump's feathers just before the election, is a perfect example of obeying in advance. So where does this phrase come from? It's the first lesson in Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. And I mentioned his book in a video last week, and I plan to make several videos based on that book. So today I want to talk about that phrase, "do not obey in advance." And I'm going to share a couple of just very practical ways to apply it to our lives. So here's how Snider explains what he means. He writes, "Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do." And he sums it up pretty nicely in this short clip from an interview that he gave to Ali Velshi last week.
Your first point on tyranny is do not obey in advance. And for people who are saying, well, it's not in advance anymore, he's now the president, that rule still stays. Your point about do not obey in advance is not about an election. It's about everything that tyrannical rule can do and every effort it makes.
Yeah, it's actually a lesson which comes directly out from the middle of authoritarian regimes. It comes from a German term. I mean, it comes from Hitler's transition to power. It comes from the middle of the 1930s, and in various ways, it was also recalled by the anti-communist dissidents of the 1970s. It's a lesson which actually comes from authoritarian regimes and not from elections. And the whole idea is that these people can't do it on their own. And if you allow yourself to believe they can do it on their own, then you're going to find yourself helping them, or at least being passive. When you say don't obey in advance, that means, who am I? What do I stand for? What's normal to me? What am I not going to do? You try to define your own reality as a free person and not to get dragged along by conformism. And that makes a huge difference, right? Not despairing, knowing what you think is right, and not conforming in advance. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of examples around us of people doing that, and we should note those examples and try to do the opposite. As in previous segments, people have said, do what state governors are doing, defy in advance, don't obey in advance.
So I think this is a super important concept to understand, and I want to apply it today to one of the most basic freedoms that I personally used to take for granted in America, our freedom to speak against those in power. I've talked with quite a few people this week who are concerned that our freedom of speech is under threat under a second Trump presidency. And it could be, it absolutely could be, if we don't protect it. And I have a simple message for today. I think that the best way to protect our free speech is to actually use it. We must not obey in advance. We must not silence ourselves in fear that if we don't silence ourselves, someone's going to silence us. They're going to silence us. So in the United States, our freedom of speech is foundational. But if we want it to remain foundational, I think we have to act like it. I think all of us do. If we silence ourselves out of fear of repercussions, then that just plays into the hands of people who just don't want us to speak out. So whatever issues we might each care about, I think it's more important now than ever before to find some productive ways to talk about those things. I just think we dare not back down on such a central freedom. So I have a couple of practical pieces of advice about that. First, I just think we should take the lesson seriously. Do not obey in advance. As the Trump administration starts to take shape, I think we just mustn't be afraid to speak truth to power when it's necessary. I'm not talking about attacking every move that Donald Trump makes or living in a state of just constant anger or resistance. Like I've mentioned before, I think it's important for each of us to just figure out where we personally can do the most good. And as things might happen that relate to the things that we know about, the things that we can speak to with some level of credibility in the culture, then I think we need to increase our public speech about those things. So that could be like on social media or a church group or within our families, but whatever way suits our own situation best, I think in that way we ought to just assert our right to simply speak about the things that we care about. We can't normalize this feeling of anxiety that people have about speaking out. If we feel like we have to start censoring ourselves to avoid ramifications, then I think we've already lost one of the most precious things about America. And I'm not willing to let that happen in my life. So I think there are far more people in this country who love democracy and the privileges that come with it, like freedom of speech, than there are those who are trying to end it. And I include a fair number of Trump voters on the side of those who at least say that they love democracy. I don't think we should be cowed by the fact that a bunch of people voted for him. I think most of them didn't vote for him in the hopes that he would silence his critics. Most of them, I think, just don't take that threat seriously. And I hope they end up being right. But, I'm watching, and as he makes some kind of threatening moves already, radically threatening, I think, like putting Matt Gaetz forward as his choice for Attorney General, he's not giving us much reason to assume that he doesn't plan to weaponize the justice system against his perceived enemies. So in the face of that possibility even, I just think we've got to simply keep asserting our right to speak and make that a habit, and just speak about the things that we care about. So then my second little piece of advice is this, though. I think that as we exercise free speech, I think we need to keep our speech pure. And so what do I mean by that? Just very simply, I mean that when we speak, let's make sure we're speaking the truth, first of all. In the face of a movement that I think seized power through an onslaught of lies and disinformation, it can be tempting to play that same game. For myself, though, I'm just never going to do that. I believe strongly, maybe naively, but that's where I live. I believe strongly that truth will triumph in the end. And I just refuse to play games with that or fudge the facts around the edges just to win a point. I think we've got to be better than that. In the same way, let's not speak hatefully. Hatred, I believe, is the engine that fuels Trump's MAGA movement. And I've spoken about that before. But hatred is poison to any movement that hopes to build a better future for our children and our grandchildren. I know I get accused of hating Donald Trump all the time because I strongly oppose him. But opposition is not hatred. I'm not going to be silenced by people who come on here and project the vitriol that they're swimming in onto anyone like me who dares to speak out against their movement. I think we should speak truth in love, always. But that doesn't mean softening our criticism of some really dark tactics that the MAGA movement has used to win power. I think we must speak out. But in doing so, we've got to be careful not to become the very thing that we're opposing. The Apostle Peter wrote some excellent advice on this, and it's good to remember that he wrote his first letter, which I'm going to quote from here, in the midst of a persecution. So I'm just going to leave you with this passage from 1 Peter, and it's one that I'm trying to live by myself with very mixed success, but I'm trying. So this is 1 Peter 3:13 through 17, and he writes, "Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." I just think that's a great passage to keep in mind in the coming months, and I hope you find that helpful. So thanks for listening.